June 22nd, 1372. The air off the coast of La Rochelle was thick with the smell of brine and fear. For the English, this day was supposed to be the glorious climax of their decades-long campaign in France, a thunderous arrival that would shatter the French siege of the port city. Instead, they sailed toward a watery ambush, unaware that the King of France, Charles V, had orchestrated a trap that would rewrite the very rules of naval warfare and bring the age of English sea supremacy to a catastrophic, fiery end. The walls of despair. The city of La Rochelle was a bastion of English power in Aquitaine, but by the summer of 1372, it was a fortress starving. French forces had thrown a tight cordon around its walls, and every soldier within knew the siege could only be broken by one thing: the massive relief convoy approaching from England. This fleet was the crown jewel of Edward III's strategy, carrying everything the English war machine needed: £12,000 in gold to pay mercenaries, essential reinforcements of knights and archers, and enough supplies to break the spirit of the besieging French. The political climate that birthed this doomed expedition was one of frantic desperation in London. The seemingly endless 100 Years' War was turning decisively against England. The brilliant French constable, Bertrand du Guesclin, had executed King Charles's master plan, avoiding pitched battles and systematically reclaiming English territories through siege and maneuver. The once vast English domain in Aquitaine had been reduced to a fragile coastal strip, held together only by sheer will and the expectation of continuous resupply. The very prestige of the English crown and the immense cost of the war demanded a dramatic intervention. Pembroke's convoy was that answer, a desperate gamble of last resort. The French siege lines, commanded by du Guesclin, were an iron fist tightening around the city's throat. The men inside La Rochelle were hungry, but their greatest commodity hope was invested entirely in the sea. They were convinced that the sheer name of English naval power would scatter any enemy. This faith was the primary weakness in the English strategic posture. Decades of dominance had bred an arrogance that blinded them to innovation and external threat. In command of this priceless flotilla was the Earl of Pembroke, John Hastings. He was a nobleman of high standing, a valiant knight, but an unfortunate choice for this mission. Pembroke was a general of the land, not the sea, and his confidence, a trait often prized in a commander, was here a terrible liability born of ignorance. He believed English naval supremacy, forged at Sluys and Calais, was an immutable law of the sea. This confidence meant he prioritized cargo space and troop capacity over genuine naval fighting strength. His vessels were the sturdy, high-sided Cogs, more like floating fortresses than agile warships designed to bring archers close for a devastating volley, not to maneuver against a faster, professional enemy. He sailed with a force of approximately 30 to 40 ships, a valuable but primarily logistical convoy, loaded high with cargo and men, making them heavy, slow targets. A royal clerk, John Wilton, accompanied Pembroke, his sole mission being the meticulous guarding of the £12,000 in coin, a treasure vital to funding the entire Aquitaine war effort for the coming year. The French king, Charles V, known as the Wise, was the antithesis of the reckless, chivalric kings who had dominated the earlier phases of the 100 Years' War. He fought not with thunderous charges but with calculation and logistics. Charles had studied his enemy's singular dependence on English Channel supply lines. He knew that to starve the English out of France, he didn't need to defeat their mighty armies on a field of honor. He merely needed to cut their lifeline at sea. It was a problem of geometry, not glory. To achieve this, he had brokered a military marriage of convenience, securing an alliance with the nascent naval power of Castile in the south. This pact delivered to him the secret weapon he needed: a professional fleet led by a commander whose name would soon be synonymous with nautical disaster for England. The stakes were astronomical, and Charles had bet the future of the French crown on a few dozen Castilian oarsmen. The price of this alliance was steep, but the potential payoff, the collapse of English logistics, was worth any sum. Fire, oars, and the unlikely alliance. For decades, the English had ruled the waters off the French coast with an arrogant certitude. They were the masters of the Cog, a ship that emphasized height for archers, turning naval combat into a floating siege. But this new enemy, the Castilian fleet, was built on a different tradition, rooted in the quick, lethal actions of the Mediterranean. While the English relied on sailing dollar, text, Cogs dollar crewed by merchant sailors and filled with land knights, the Castilians deployed the sleek, serpentine galleys. These vessels were low to the water, typically 150 feet long, and powered by hundreds of oarsmen, making them capable of a dizzying speed and agility that the English ships could only dream of achieving against the wind. The Castilian fleet numbered only about 22 professional galleys, a smaller number than the English total vessels, but they represented focused, specialized destruction. In command of these vessels was the Genoese mercenary, Admiral Ambrosio Boccanegra. Where Pembroke was a confident land general at sea, Boccanegra was a cold, calculating master of the waves. He had learned his trade in the eternal naval chess game of the Mediterranean, where speed and fire mattered more than tonnage. He knew the limitations of the cog, its dependence on wind, its slow speed, and its vulnerability below the waterline. His galleys were not just fast, they were instruments of focused, chemical warfare. The most critical detail was the Castilian technological advantage: incendiary weapons. The galleys were equipped with devices to spray boiling pitch, resin, and sulfur onto an enemy deck, which could then be ignited instantly by flaming arrows or bolts. They were designed not for the brutal hand-to-hand slugfest the English expected, but for swift, calculated annihilation. Boccanegra's strategy was simple: avoid the English archers by staying low and mobile, choose the time and place of battle with precision, and use fire to turn the high-sided English dollar, text, Cogs dollar, into massive, uncontrollable funeral pyres. He intended to beat the English not with courage, but with chemistry and hydrodynamics. On the morning of June 22nd, the two fleets sighted one another. Pembroke, blinded by the perceived superiority of his English knights, advanced toward the Castilian line, eager to begin the engagement he believed would be over by nightfall. The initial clash was fierce. English archers on the high decks of the dollar, text Cogs, dollar rained arrows down, forcing Boccanegra to keep his galleys moving. The English archers inflicted damage, but the Castilian admiral was not interested in a messy, honorable brawl. He was interested in the inescapable mathematics of the sea. Boccanegra's initial attacks were probing, designed to test the English line, not break it. His galleys zipped in, unleashed a few devastating volleys of crossbow bolts, and then swiftly retreated, using their oars to evade the predictable turns of the sailing dollar, text, Cogs dollar. Pembroke, misreading this tactical dance as timidity, pressed harder. He failed to comprehend that Boccanegra wasn't fighting the wind, the sea, or the English ships. He was fighting the clock and the tide. The tide's treachery. The true weapon on that first day was neither arrow nor flame, but the sheer, crushing power of the natural world. The Bay of Biscay, where the battle unfolded, is notorious for its massive tidal variation, with differences between high and low tide reaching up to 16 feet. This was the detail Boccanegra knew would decide the conflict. As the two fleets traded volleys near the mouth of the harbour channel, Boccanegra kept his low-draft galleys in the deeper channels, frustrating Pembroke's attempts to close and board. English captains, focused on protecting the precious convoy, were maneuvered by the Castilians into increasingly shallow waters as the tide began its inevitable, long fall. Then, the Castilian admiral made his masterful, deceptive maneuver. Observing that the hour was drawing late and the tide was rapidly receding, Boccanegra staged a subtle, partial retreat away from the shallows. Pembroke, sensing weakness and desperate to secure the port before the French siege tightened further, made the fatal mistake of ordering a full pursuit into the harbour channel. The English dollar, text Cogs dollar, with their heavy cargo of gold and their deep keels, were pushed by the falling water into the shallow, muddy estuary. The grounding was not instantaneous, but a slow, sickening realization. First, the movement became sluggish, then the rudders ceased to respond. Finally, with a grinding lurch, the great dollar, text Cogs dollar, one after another, came to a dead stop in the soft mud of the seabed. They were caught at the absolute bottom of the tidal cycle. It was not a rout, but a geometric trap, set by a brilliant mind. One by one, the English ships began to heel over, their heavy hulls grounding in the unforgiving mud of the seabed. The Earl of Pembroke watched in dawning horror as his proud, confident fleet became utterly immobilized. By dusk, the entire English fighting and transport convoy was trapped, helpless, leaning at ridiculous angles in the mire. They were ships of the line that could not fight, their archers suddenly unable to maintain footing or aim down at the water. Boccanegra, having sacrificed only a few ships, anchored his light galleys safely in deeper water, a silent, menacing line of waiting predators. The long night that followed was a descent into psychological torment for the English. Knights and soldiers, trained to face death with a sword in their hand, could do nothing but wait. They were marooned a few dozen yards from shore, their ships vulnerable, the priceless £12,000 of gold resting just a few feet below their decks, yet utterly beyond their power to move or defend. The lack of control was terrifying. They argued fiercely over desperate plans to escape under cover of darkness, but the water was too shallow for a safe flight and too deep for a retreat to shore. As the air grew cold, every man knew that his fate was sealed not by the courage of his arm, but by the relentless, indifferent return of the tide. The very natural forces they had ignored were now their executioners. If you're gripped by this story of naval strategy and catastrophic defeat, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more hidden history. We're digging into the most compelling turning points that shaped the world. The Inferno of the Sea. The morning of June 23rd dawned on a scene of total, crushing exposure for the English. As the high tide finally began to return, slowly lifting the great dollar, text Cogs dollar from the mud, it brought not salvation, but slaughter. The Castilian galleys, which had waited with inhuman patience, returned to the attack. This time, they did not hold back. Boccanegra was not interested in boarding. He wanted absolute annihilation. His fleet, sleek and low, rowed swiftly toward the partially submerged, slowly floating dollar, text Cogs dollar. The English ships, still recovering their balance and unable to coordinate, were easy prey. The English commanders, having survived the night, now faced their worst nightmare. Professional soldiers trained only for land warfare, suddenly forced to fight a technological and tactical mismatch. The attack was orchestrated with terrifying efficiency. The galleys approached from multiple angles, their low profiles minimizing exposure to the English archers who struggled to adjust their aim from the newly refloated, pitching decks. From their decks, the Castilians launched a devastating barrage of the infernal weapons. These were not random assaults, they were targeted attacks against the sails, rigging, and decks. Cauldrons of boiling oil, mixed with pitch, resin, and sulfur, were hurled onto the decks. The fire weapons created an instant sheet of flame, which was then spread by volleys of fire arrows and crossbow bolts wrapped in oil-soaked cloth. The result was instantaneous horror. The massive wooden cogs, unable to maneuver or respond effectively, became floating furnaces. The first sign of trouble was the thick, black smoke that choked the air and burned the eyes, followed by the terrifying sight of wooden decks igniting into unstoppable walls of flame. English soldiers, clad in heavy armor for land battle, were trapped. The dollar, text Cogs dollar, were not designed to be watertight. The oil and flaming pitch dripped down onto the cargo and soldiers below deck, turning the holds into cauldrons. The heavy plate armor that protected the knight on a battlefield now became a suffocating oven. Many were incinerated alive as flames spread across the decks and climbed the masts. Others, faced with a choice between fire and water, threw themselves overboard only to drown, weighed down by their steel plate. The English defense dissolved as entire ships were engulfed. The captains found their orders drowned out by the roar of the flames and the terror of their men. Discipline evaporated. The sheer terror of this form of fighting a silent, creeping fire that erupted into a conflagration was what shattered the resolve of the English fighting men. They were prepared for steel, not sulfur. The young Earl of Pembroke was among the few hundred knights and soldiers to survive the flames, forced to surrender as his flagship, surrounded by fire and smoke, became untenable. The Castilians captured him along with nearly 400 knights and over 8,000 soldiers, not counting the countless dead. The entire English fleet, approximately 48 ships, was captured, destroyed, or sunk. The great prize, the 12,000 pounds of gold, was seized by Boccanegra. It was not just a defeat, it was a military extinction. The English lost not only the ships, but the entire logistical spine of their campaign. The shift in the sea power, the smoke that rose over the Bay of Biscay that day, marked the definitive end of an era. The sheer scale of the English loss, the entire fleet, the army's treasury, and the commander was unprecedented in the 100 Years' War and stands as one of the worst naval defeats in English history. The immediate consequences were swift and devastating. Without the promised gold and reinforcements, the morale of the English garrison at La Rochelle evaporated. The city, which had clung to hope for the arrival of the convoy, surrendered to the French within weeks. The French then swiftly moved to capture more critical ports in the region, using their newly secured sea lanes for logistical advantage. The defeat of the Earl of Pembroke triggered a cascade failure across the English territories in Aquitaine. The English grip on the region, already tenuous, began to unravel completely. Town after town, seeing that the invincible English navy could not even defend its own supplies, defected to the French crown, recognizing that their overseas lifeline had been severed. For the first time in decades, the English were not only defeated on land, but were now isolated, cut off from home by a hostile sea. This battle was far more than a loss of ships and men. It was a seismic shift in sea power. The control of the English Channel and the Bay of Biscay, long an immutable English right, now belonged to the Franco-Castilian alliance. This naval supremacy allowed the Allied fleet to launch devastating raids directly onto the English coast over the next few years, plundering and burning ports like Rye, Portsmouth, and Hastings itself. The terrifying reality was that England was no longer an inviolable island fortress. The Castilian galleys proved that even the English home shores were vulnerable. The sheer political shock of these raids galvanized opposition to King Edward III and his unpopular war policies, contributing to a political crisis in England known as the Good Parliament. King Charles V of France, the man who had the foresight to seek out the technological and strategic edge of the Castilian galley and fire tactics, saw his patient plan pay off exponentially. His strategy proved that in medieval warfare, controlling the supply line on the water was often more valuable than winning 100 battles on the land. He had achieved in 2 days on the water what years of land sieges had failed to do, fatally cripple the English war effort. The victory demonstrated the strategic weakness of relying on unspecialized transport vessels against a dedicated war fleet, especially one led by a master tactician. The Battle of La Rochelle was a lesson etched in fire and water, that professional expertise and calculated strategy, even with fewer numbers, could crush overconfidence and outdated doctrine. The defeat shattered the English morale and financial capacity, ushering in the lowest point of the war for the English monarchy and cementing the Castilian galley as the preeminent warship of the era. The victory allowed France to rise from a beleaguered kingdom to a confident power, all thanks to the genius of a Genoese admiral and the devastating use of fire on the sea. If you found this exploration of history's greatest naval upset compelling, make sure you share this video with someone who needs to hear this story of fire and water. And let us know in the comments which incredible medieval conflict you think we should dissect next. This battle reminds us that the tides of history often turn not on the expected fields of glory, but on the hidden currents of brilliant strategy, the cruel arithmetic of the tide, and the terrifying innovation of fire. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the battles that shaped the world and ring the bell so you never miss a new episode.